Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Mohammed Al-Dali and I'm learning data science on my own. I'm going to share my experience with Code Alpha and big thanks to Code Alpha for allowing me to participate in their internship program about data science. So I made a previous video where I went through the IRIS dataset and I'm now going through the unemployment dataset, which contains information about unemployment rate and related concepts in India surrounding the coronavirus lockdown period. So we can see how it affected the employment rate and so in India. So we're going to do some experimental data analysis and see some visualization regarding our data so we can derive insights and see how things went during that period in India. So we first start with importing packages. We can first start by importing pandas for data manipulation, matplotlib, seaboard, and plotly express for data visualization. Then we import the dataset itself and store it in the df variable, and seeing the head of the dataset we see the region column, date column, frequency, unemployment rate, estimated employed, participation rate, and area columns. And as we can see, the frequency is monthly, which means that the data was collected each month and stored in this dataset. We can also see that the area is rural, so we can split data into rural and urban. So we're going to start with the information about our data to see how the data types and missing values are using the info method. So we got 768 entries or rows in our data set, but we can see that there are 740 non-null content, which means there are 28 missing rows or missing values. And since each of the columns has the same number of missing values, we can assume that there are some rows that didn't contain any information in our data set. So we can drop them easily. And to make sure that this assumption is correct, here we can see the rows that contain no information at all, and we can see that the whole row is filled with missing values. So we can drop them with the drop NA method, and then we can see that there are now no missing values at all. Also, we checked for duplicates, and there are no duplicated values in our dataset. Now we can describe our statistics for the numerical columns in our data. So we can see that the first date is 5/31, which means June, and June, and then it ended in the July 2020. And then we got some statistics like the mean, the minimum, maximum, and different percentiles and the standard deviation for our numerical data, like unemployment rate, estimated employed, and participation rate. And we can see that the mean unemployment rate is 11%, and there are around 7 million workers there, and 42% the participation rate with the mean. And here we're going to start with a pair plot, and what a pair plot is showing us how the numerical columns correlate together and the distribution of the numerical columns on the diagonal axis. So we can see that we can't really rely on this pair plot to see how the correlation works, but we can see that the unemployed rate and the estimated employed are skewed to the right, but we can also see that the participation rate is like normally distributed. To get better insight about the correlation between our numerical columns, we can draw a heat map that shows us the correlation. So we can see that there are not actually pretty well correlation between the data. Of course, this 100% correlation here is not useful because it shows us the correlation between the column and itself. So of course it's going to be 1. But we can see, although that the correlation is weak, like 0.22, however, it's still enough for us to say that, for example, the unemployment rate and the estimated employed are negatively correlated, And this makes sense because as the number of employment people increase, the unemployment rate is going to decrease. Next, we're going to plot a box plot on the left and a bar plot on the right that is going to be an increasing order that shows us how the employment rate is distributed for different regions. And so we can see, for example, that 50% of the regions have an employment rate below 10%. However, it exceeds at some different regions. For example, Tripura has the highest employment rate, was like 27%, and then we have Haryana, and other regions that got a high unemployment rate. And here we can see the distribution, and one thing that we can derive is from the outliers. So although some regions have pretty low unemployment rate, the outliers tell us that the unemployment rate went too high in some specific time, because it's not normal that it's going to reach, for example, 75% here. And this is our first idea that we got, that we can say that how the coronavirus affected this unemployment rate in these regions. So to go deeper and see how the unemployment rate is distributed by regions and area, we can see this sunbursted chart, and as we can see, the urban areas have larger unemployment rate compared to rural areas. So this is sensible because urban areas have larger concentration of people, and so the unemployment rate is supposed to be higher compared to the rural area. So we can also say that the unemployment rate in the rural area is also high, and maybe that's because when people faced corona, they maybe went to the rural areas for safety or even for like searching for a job there, and so the unemployment rate even in the rural area is relatively high. And anyway, we can see that Tripura and Haryana are still the regions that got the highest unemployment rate, whether in the urban sections or in the rural sections. So the top 5 regions with the highest employment rate are Tripura, Haryana, Jharkhand, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh. And what we're really interested in now is to see how the unemployment rate, the participation rate, and the number of employed people varied over time. So we can see, for example, for the unemployment rate, it was like the mean unemployment rate was between 7 and like 10% before the lockdown. But then when the coronavirus attacked and the lockdown started on April, the unemployment rate went up strikingly and even reached 25% before going down after the lockdown was finished. And this is also seen compared to the participation rate, which was high at like 43%, but it then went low during this period because less people are going to look for jobs because they are putting safety first. And also we can see this big dip in the number of employed people during the lockdown. So it went down to like from 7.5 to 5.3 in the lockdown. And this shows us how the lockdown pretty affected all the different metrics related to the unemployment rate during coronavirus period. So here we're going to take a box plot also about the unemployment rate and the participation rate over time. So we can focus more on the distribution, not just on the mean of the unemployment rate and the participation rate over time. So as we can see here, on April and on May, the unemployment rate went higher, and even the distribution went also larger, and we can see that there are some outliers between 70% and 80%. So some regions had pretty large unemployment rates. Similarly, we can see how the participation rate went down during the lockdown. What's also a good insight to derive is that the unemployment rate and participation rate gradually went back to normal after the lockdown was shut down. So we're going to take a look now at a second data set, which is similar to the first one, to the unemployment data set, but it has like more geographical information, the area to south, east, west, and so, and the latitude and the longitude columns, but we still got the region, data, frequency, unemployment, estimated employed, and labor participation columns. So what we can do with this second data set is we can see how things show on the map of India, how we can, for example, visualize the employment rate on the map itself. So I did the same information as before, checking for any data type constraints, any missing values, any duplicated values, do some statistics with the describe method. But what I found is that the latitude and longitude columns were swapped in the original dataset. So I had to swap them back to correct them, and the reason I was able to detect this fault is because of the true values of latitude and longitude, and later when I draw the map, so it didn't really show on India, so I had to swap the latitude and longitude columns, and things then went well. So I again made a visualization of the correlation and of the heat map of the correlation. We still got the same information because just the same data. And here I've made again a box plot and a bar plot in increasing order for the unemployment rates, participation rate, and the number of employed. And we can still see that Tripura and Haryana are the regions with the highest unemployment rate. So here is the same for the participation rate. It's also the highest in Tripura and Haryana and Meghalaya. And the reason Tripura has the highest participation rate and at the same time the highest employment rate is that they traditionally go up together, the participation rate and employment rate, because when when less people are looking for work, we can say that maybe less people are being employed. So I again did the overtime visualization of the unemployment, participation rate, and number of employed people, and we can still see how during lockdown between April and June the unemployment rate went up, participation rate and the number of workers went down, and we can now see more that the unemployment rate after the lockdown, the post-lockdown period, went back to normal, but the number of employed people and the participation rate didn't go as well as the employment rate, and that's maybe because the coronavirus was still going on, and for safety reasons people didn't went gradually to their work. So now we're going to see how the unemployment and participation rates differ by area. So we can see that the highest unemployment rate is in the north and the east, and they're the lowest ones to have the participation rate. And we now can also see that in the sunburst plot similar to the first dataset. So as we can see, the north has the highest unemployment rate. And here is the power of the second dataset. Because of the latitude and longitude columns, we can plot a map of India, and on the map we can see the unemployment rate. So the bigger the size of this circle, the larger of the unemployment rate. And shown, I've shown the median, the mean unemployment rate in the north, west, and the different areas in our dataset. So as we can see, the north and here the west got some high unemployment rate, and also here in the south. So now the most important thing that I did with this dataset is to compare the percentage of a change in the unemployment rate before and after the lockdown, before and during the lockdown. So here I made a percentage of change in employment rate by region after Corona, and the reason why I split this into two is that the unemployment rate was too extreme in some areas. So we can see that the unemployment rate was negative here in Sikkim, and I'm gonna show you why. It's not supposed to be negative because things were actually going up, but we can see that for most of the regions, the unemployment rate percentage of increase is like starting from 25%, and it even went as high as 60%. And here we can see that in Puducherry, for example, the unemployment rate went as high as 5,000%. So this means that Puducherry was actually an area where the unemployment rate was too low, maybe like 1% or so, and then went too high, reaching maybe the 80% or 70% outliers. And that's why we can see that the increase is like 5,000%, and that's because initially it has like a null unemployment rate. And so here are plots for the employment rate change in Sikkim and Puducherry. So the reason why I did it in Sikkim to show you why we got a negative rate, and this is the lockdown period here in red, and this is the blue is the period before and after lockdown. And as we can see, there's no period before Sikkim, so we can see that data were collected just when the lockdown started, and that's the reason why it's negative, because there's no the unemployment rate was high and then it went really down. So this drop over here accounts for the negative change that we got. But what actually went is that the unemployment rate went too high then in June. And here on the right we can see how the unemployment rate varied during lockdown in Puducherry. And Puducherry, as we saw before, had a 5,000% increase in employment rate. The reason is that, as we can see here, the unemployment rate before lockdown was just about 1%, and so this means that Puducherry is like a pretty working area where most people are working. So during lockdown it went as high as 75%, and this shows us why there's 5,000% increase. This shows us how the lockdown affected Puducherry. So in general we can see that during lockdown the unemployment rate, the participation rate, and the number of workers were affected in India. So the unemployment rate went up, the participation rate went down because less people were seeking work, and of course the number of workers went down. So I hope I made this explanation pretty clear, and I hope I made things concise, and thank you again for joining me in this explanation.